Hello, babies, and welcome back to D-Talk, your safe space to explore your creativity, expand your critical thinking skills, and embrace your cringe. Now, today on the podcast, I bring to you yet again another final project, and it is called Teacher as Redacted. So there is this presentation that's going to be running alongside me here, but of course, you don't need that to enjoy this. If you're listening to this podcast on Spotify and you're interested to watch the video and see my beautiful face and how I've color coordinated my outfits with the set and the presentation, feel free to do that. Yeah, without further ado, my presentation is called Teacher as Redacted. So we're going to have a look at some curriculum theory here today, and we're going to look at the role of the teacher in the 21st century classroom and what I personally think education is all about. So besties, if you're interested in that, like, comment, and subscribe. If you like the video, consider subscribing. If you don't like the video, consider subscribing. If you haven't been here before, my name is David, and if you have been here before, my name is still David. So without further ado, besties, let's get into Teacher as Redacted, my look at educational theory in the 21st century classroom. Okay? This podcast, what we're going to talk about today is this idea of identity construction, because a big part of what we do as human beings is construct our own sense and meaning of reality. And I'm really interested in taking a look at how we create our own sense of identity and how other people create their own sense of identity for us. You know what I mean? Like, the way that I think about myself isn't the way that other people think about me. And what happens in those situations when those conceptions of a human being don't align, which is almost always. It's impossible for me to think something about myself and for everybody else around me to think that exact same thing about me. It's just not a reality. And a lot of the times, those broken expectations can lead to life dissatisfaction, a not positive school experience. A lot of our conversation here today is going to be focused on the arts-based instruction, the arts-infused instruction. I fully believe that curriculum and everything that is done in a classroom needs to be done in an art-infused way in order to make everybody around feel safe, because if you don't feel safe, you can't learn. And if you're not learning, girl, what are you doing in that classroom? Through an arts-based approach, we're going to explore creativity, confidence, and connection. And here on this podcast, we talk a lot about exploring our creativity, leaning into our cringe, and sharpening our critical thinking skills. And those three C's are super important, but we're going to add another C here, which is connection, because you need to connect before you correct. So that's a big part of how you are connecting, not only with students, but with parents, community members, educational stakeholders of any kind. Connection is super important. And I feel like a lot of people lack the skills and experience in order to make those meaningful connections in educative settings. So we're going to get into that as well. The way that we're going to frame this conversation is we're going to look at the different roles of teachers in the 21st century classroom, and that is going to be through the lens of performer, parent, friend, supervisor, victim, producer, facilitator, artist, novice, hero, jester, transmitter, activist, scientist, caregiver, and human. And we are going to talk a little bit about the transgenerational epigenetics and how an arts-based approach can support students in a trauma-informed framework. Now, that word salad just basically means that the way that our ancestors lived before us has a big impact about how our genes not only are formed, but the ways that they may be turned on and off based off of the ways that we both live our life in nature and nurture. This nature versus nurture is a big part of this conversation, especially in education, and we're going to talk about that here today as well. We're going to unpack the fabricated social realities of bias, such as masculinity and homophobia, because these ways of discrimination, the structures that we live in right now, and the ways that they uphold a lot of discrimination plays a really big role in education and in curriculum development as well. So we're going to discuss that. We're going to talk about holism in education, which is basically just looking at everything from a big macro perspective. Everything is so incredibly interrelated. The way that you do one thing is in fact the way that you do most things, I believe. If you're not looking at the bigger picture and looking at the interconnectedness of everything, you can't really isolate everything down into single experiences, especially when it comes down to education. So we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about the Minnesota twin experiment, the Dutch hunger winter, and trauma-informed dental care. Intrigued? You should be. Let's go. It's funny because the first one that we're going to talk about is the performer, and I feel like I'm doing that for you right now. I am performing. Are you intrigued? You should be. Let's go. This like colloquialism used in these professional settings just always gets me really good, because pretty much everything is a performance. Now, one thing I want to mention here before we really kick off into these different roles of the teacher in the 21st century classroom, what I want you to do as you're listening to this is I want you to think about what education means and what curriculum means, because a lot of the times we can really pigeonhole these ideas in that education is only meant for K-12 classrooms, or maybe even you could be looping post-secondary institutions in there as well. But really, education, curriculum, that is the way in which we live. The transfer of information is education. The changing of minds, the integration of new ideas, that is education. But that's not That's not when you sit down in a classroom and are specifically learning something. That is the way that we navigate our world at every given point. If I'm sitting in my apartment and the windows are open and I hear a big bang, it could be any number of things, and I'm basically just guessing at what all of those things are. But my guesses are usually narrowed down through the lens of previous experience. So it could be a car backfiring, it could be a gunshot. There's so many things that are working kind of behind the scenes in my brain in order to make some judgments in that moment that would impact my safety, my comfort, all of the above. So a lot of the times, our brains behave in ways that are due to our past that we're not able to recognize in the moment. And we think that's just how that happens, and that we don't have control over a lot of the things that we do in fact have control over. And that's one of my arguments here, is that we actually have the magnitude to control a lot of these more abstract kind of concepts than we really do. We may lack the ability to track these abstract concepts, but I fully believe that we have a lot more control than we're giving ourselves credit for, especially when it comes to this social emotional learning and how we are able to connect with those around us in order to learn, because that's essentially the only way that we're going to make a meaningful impact on people, is if we're connecting with them. The first thing that we're going to look at here is the teacher as performer. So we think of the performer as like the music star, the theater, all of these things. So everything that we do as a human being is a performance. As RuPaul says, we're all born naked and the rest is drag. Everything that you do, when you wake up in the morning, you brushing your teeth, you putting in an earring, you styling your hair in this way, you putting on the clothes that you've curated in some specific way, the shoes that you wear, the food that you eat, all of the things that you do in life, I do believe are a performance. Because in order to do something, you have to be somebody. And that performance really implies who you are, not only to other people around you, but to yourself. The activities that you do build your sense of identity. So I think the teacher as performer is a very valid way of constructing this idea of curriculum, because it's everything that you do is noticed by your students and people around you, whether they are doing it in a conscious way or not. The way that you deal with problems and adversity and unknown things and not being good at something and attempting to be bad at something new, and all of these things that you do as a teacher that come down to who you are as a person and your personality and the way that you approach the world, regardless to your teaching practice, really has an impact on your students, whether they know it or not, because they are modeling your behavior at almost every point, again, almost unknowingly. So if you are behaving in ways that are unbeknownst to you, if you are not aware of the ways that you perform, both as a human being and as a teacher in a classroom, you're kind of doing the students a bit of a disservice there, because you need to know the ways that you're acting and you need to know the reasons of why you are acting the way that you are, because your students are picking up on it. Sometimes I've heard this argument against the teacher as performer because it can feel inauthentic. We have seen schools where people are prescribed how to decorate their classrooms. I remember probably about 10, 15 years ago, there was a practice called Reggio. I don't know if I'm saying that right or if that's still a thing, but Reggio was so specific of like how you could decorate your classrooms, and there couldn't be any patterns and it couldn't be bright. It had to be earth tones. There couldn't be any borders around your, it was this, it was that. And there were all these reasons as to not distract the students by all of this extraneous information that would lead to them not learning the important things. And I'm pretty sure that left as quickly as it came. And that's probably part of the reason that a lot of these teachers have bandwagon fatigue, because there's always some new big thing that's just going to fix everything, like just going to sit down and drink this green tea and everything's going to be solved. When in fact, it's not like that. It's a lifelong process that you engage in as an educator and as a human being to hone your performance skills in order to effectively educate a group of anybody. Right? So my citation is there. We see this not only in structures of ways to decorate your classrooms, but we see this in like reading assessments and testing and all of these like boxes that can show up in your classroom that you can administer to the students. And the whole point of the structure part of these lessons or assessments is to eliminate any interference by the teacher, which really, I'm thinking of a synonym to say that sucks, but it really blows, because the whole point, like what makes somebody interesting is their charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent. Like you want the uniqueness of each individual teacher in order to draw in students because of that performance. So if you're eliminating any uniqueness from the teacher through these standardized assessments or lessons, that's boring. Don't be boring. So the role of authentic performance, you need to have yourself at a spot of enough self-confidence in order to perform in a way that is not self-conscious. Like if you don't have confidence in yourself or enough confidence in yourself, your students can sense that, and that really isn't an authentic performance. So if we look at it as like a continuum, if if we have authentic performance over here and we have inauthentic performance over here, I feel like if somebody is self-conscious, you're on the continuum getting close to that authentic performance. But I feel like a lot of people view this performance, this teacher as performance aspect as a false binary, right? If it's not 100% and if it's not all the way there, you're lying and it's inauthentic and you're putting on a show and it's a farce. When it's not like that. It's not inauthentic. It's not farcical. Is that a word? It's not inauthentic unless you are genuinely putting in effort to make it inauthentic. Because you can even take your self-consciousness and your lack of self-confidence and kind of translate that into some sort of authenticity if you are sharing that with your students. You can bring them into those conversations and explain to them how you're feeling, and that will create an authentic performance. But you have to be ready and willing to dissolve the ego bit. You need to be able to let go of your ego there enough in order to make the curriculum that you deliver to them authentic through this performance as your role as a teacher. So that's teacher as performer. And our next one is teacher as parent and friend. This one is really argued. This one is really argued by a lot of people because I'm your teacher. I'm not your friend. I think that's garbage. I'm your teacher. I'm not your parent. That I can get on board with. But I think what I mean here by parent is this kind of parental relationship where you need to be able to have, I don't know if authority is the right way, but you need to have this relationship with your students that has such a high level of trust that they're willing to listen to you beyond the reasonability that they would listen to a friend. Oh, actually, I don't know if I believe that because I want my students to be critical of me as well. There are things that I've said to groups of kids that were completely wrong. It happens all the time. We say wrong things all the time. I want those kids, I want those students to be listening to me, to be able to correct me and question me if they think something is wrong, because if they think something is wrong, they're probably right. They may not be. And I need to be able to communicate, and we need to build that idea of curriculum together because it is this constructed idea that we build together as a collaborative group of people. I'm not just this parent or omnipotent leader who is just barking down these things at these people in order for them to learn. It doesn't work like that. So is it possible to have this like friend aspect with your students and this parental aspect with your students? Can you have this leadership role and camaraderie role at the same time? Can you do that? And the way that I want to talk about this is this subtle art of code switching and my story time, which is called Replanting Palm Trees in the Rain. Now, this is a true story. Now, back when I was teaching grade 4, I had in my classroom, I'm really into plants, and I've had plants in my classroom because I really love the feeling of nature, and I love the green and the photosynthesis, and it was even part of the units that we had in science, quite explicitly. So you can connect this kind of eco-pedagogy to pretty much anything that you do in the classroom, of course, but it was even because we had the like hydroponics setup and the slow trickle of water was just gorgeous on the ears as we're doing everything. I had a beautiful classroom that had a lot of space for different plants. So I had palm trees, like real angel palms, I think they were called. So in big silver buckets, and then the palm trees were in, and I had rocks over top to make them nice because I didn't want kids digging in the dirt. And sometimes dirt is fun to eat for some people, and I can understand that. I like biting on styrofoam. God, no, I'm really trying to find the line of how colloquial I'm okay with this being or not. But isn't that the thing? You have to create, when you're presenting information, you have to be interesting. I suppose you don't have to be interesting, but if you want people to listen, if you want authentic memories to be encoded in a meaningful way in the brains of the people who are listening to you, you need to do it in such a way that is authentic to you. And what is authentic to me is this kind of colloquial sense of humor and this hyperbolic kind of language that I use in order to feel authentic. So I don't want you, the listener, to be listening to this and thinking this kind of colloquial language is giving off this sense of not professionalism, because this is very professional. And this is how I conduct myself when I am a teacher and when I am a leader as well. And you know what? Everybody's interested in what I have to say because I am doing it in a way that is exciting. And it's not this monotone, kind of boring way of approaching life. And I've also honed these skills because I've noticed the effectiveness of them. I do have the ability as a teacher. I'm going to get on my soapbox. Here we are. I'm not even in the story yet. I have this ability as a teacher to so subtly and effectively do this code switching between parent and friend because you need that parental aspect. You need that sense of authority. It needs to be there. It has to, even just for a sense of safety as you're their leader. But you also need this friendly aspect. You have to connect with your students on their level. And a really simple and easy way to do that, maybe not simple and easy, but an effective way to do that is from this friend level. I have that ability because I've honed that, and it is not unprofessional. So I just need to put that note in there. Okay, so now we're going to get into the story of replanting palm trees in the rain. This is one of my favorite stories ever. So when I was teaching grade 4, I had a lot of plants in my classroom and I had these palm trees. And you know what? As any plant owner will know, sometimes bugs happen. Sometimes fruit flies happen, sometimes gnats happen, and especially like we had the hydroponics situation set up, so there was a lot of area for these bugs to live in. There was a lot of food for them to consume and water for them to sit in, and it just and like grade 4 like students and there's snacks shoved in the back of desks. Like these bugs were having a field day in our classroom. And unfortunately, these bugs had made a colony in the 2, maybe 3 palm trees that I had in the back of the classroom. And I noticed this. Ooh, my skin is crawling just thinking about it. I remember going over to one of them and just like tapping it with my pencil, and all of these bugs started flying out. It was super gross. So I thought, you know what? We need to do something with this, and we need to do something with this now because like this is now kind of bordering on this safety, right? So I remember the kids were doing math or what have you, and it's kind of self-sufficient at this point, and those kids were doing their things, and I went over to some kids and I said, hey, do you want to help me? Because I'm the kind of teacher who asks help for everything, and those kids love doing weird things, like not weird things, but like random things. People love those idiosyncrasies in the tasks. People love those random things that are different from their normal routine. And we're going to talk about that later as well. And it was a spring day. It was rainy. It was overcast. It was windy. But I needed help from some kids because my plan was I was going to take these palm trees and we're going to go outside as to not create a huge mess inside, and we needed to get these bugs out of there. So what we were going to do is we were going to replant these palm trees because we had to, and I wasn't willing to throw them out because they were beautiful and I knew I could fix them. So I had some insecticide spray, I had new dirt, and we're outside and we're replanting these things, and like it was messy. Like we're dealing with dirt. It's raining. There's bugs everywhere. It's like windy and overcast. And then, a big wind gust comes up and then you get the dirt in the face. And like, I felt so bad because these kids were covered in dirt and like, it was gross. It was a gross time. But I took a step back and I really looked at what was happening, and these kids were having the time of their lives. They were having the best times because it was such a weird and random situation that had never happened for them before, and probably will never happen for them again in that exact same way. And it was just so funny and random, right? And I remember there was, what was it? I think I had like clay balls in the bottom of the planter, and that just assists with like the water retention so the roots at the bottom don't dry out completely if you wait too long in between waterings, etc. And those were like expensive, and I didn't have any new ones of those. So I was asking the kids if they could like just grab those, because we dumped it out and we were like spreading the dirt out in the grass so it wouldn't look obnoxious. But I was like, can you just grab those clay balls and put them back? And like that was the point where things got really messy. And I remember one of these girls who was really quiet. She was really quiet. We didn't really connect that well. And I don't think it actually, in fact, I know it didn't have anything to do with me. This student in particular was just very shy, very quiet, and wasn't really comfortable going out of their way to make a connection with anybody, students or adults and teachers alike. And I appreciated this kid just like anybody else, but they were really quiet and we didn't have that strong of a relationship in comparison to other kids in the room who were a little bit more outspoken. But she was a hard worker, and this, it doesn't matter, she was a hard worker, but anyway. And I remember this girl got frustrated with me in like a funny way, and she had like a fistful of these clay balls and she threw them at me, and like it was probably one of the funniest things. And I remember laughing so hard and shrieking in quite a feminine way, to be honest. Is there any other way to shriek? And I remember shrieking when she like whipped these at me. And there was a moment where I saw on her face this amount of joy and humor and like connection that I had never seen on this student's face before. And I remember reflecting on that and thinking that so many teachers would have seen that as like, what's the word? Defiance or like disrespect, because a lot of people wear that sense of ego on their shoulder and they would get upset if somebody did that to them, but not me. I thought that was hilarious. And like, I elicited that meaningful, authentic response. And that would, like, if we look at other teachers in the school, that student wouldn't have done that to other teachers because they would have seen them as that parent role, that authority role, and that's not what you do to those people. That was a friend moment that I had with that student. And a lot of teachers aren't okay with that because their egos are too strong and they see themselves, at this higher level than their students. And I don't. I thought that was funny. I was a little bit annoyed because, yeah, I was covered in that dirt after, but like, whatever, it doesn't matter to me. It was hilarious. And I know that student's going to remember it. About 5 minutes later, we finish up, we replanted the palms, the rocks are back on. It's great. The bugs are gone. Insecticide has been spritzed. And as we're leaving our little planting area on the grass, I go and I see this girl and she's like going to grab another handful of the dirt. And I kind of see the wheels turning and she's winding up and she's going to hit me again with these. And I remember looking at her and going, no, thanks. And she just looked, and without like an upset face or like an anger expression, she just like put it back down and walked right back in. And it was in that moment, there had to be that subtle code switch, and there had to be that difference in the language that I would use in order to differentiate the role that I was speaking from in that moment. Was I from a parent role or was I from a friend role? You need to be able to have both. And sometimes kids aren't able to recognize those little idiosyncrasies in the way that you use language in your timbre and cadence, etc. But this student was. And it was just such a beautiful moment of like, you can recognize the moments where it's time to be silly and stupid and fun and weird. And you can also recognize the moments where that's not appropriate and we have things to do now. Not everybody has that ability. And I think that having that ability and having that kind of connection with your students enables you to teach them in such a meaningful way. And that kind of stuff is like, that kind of connection makes such a rich kind of relationship where you're able to develop and deliver curriculum to those kids through that relationship lens that you wouldn't have access to any other way. It's so much more meaningful if you can have all these kinds of relationships with these students in order to connect with them so you can correct them so they can learn. We are going to look at the teacher as the supervisor. Okay, so it looks like we have a quote here. Teaching is not psychoanalysis, but consciously or unconsciously, teachers deal nevertheless in repression, denial, ignorance, resistance, fear, and desire whenever we teach. That's a heavy list. Let's read those again. Repression, denial, ignorance, resistance, fear, and desire. I do agree with that. I think that's true. I think a problem with that, however, could be is that is asking so much of these teachers. And it's not that it's like our government is asking that of us. It's these students are asking that of us just on such a basic evolutionary level. These kinds of feelings exist and they're out there, and we're not always trained in how to deal with these things. So this supervisory role, this idea of pedagogical watchfulness in order to not only recognize but somehow work in these ideas of repression, denial, ignorance, resistance, fear, and desire into your curriculum in the way that you deliver it is such a skill. This supervisory role is very important. You need to have this idea. You need to have this watchful eye of what is going on at all times. Only 7% of communication are the words that we say, and around 40% is the way that we say it, and the rest is all of these other extraneous things like body language, cadence, timbre, speed, facial expression, body language. It's all there. Anyway, as a consequence, teachers must cultivate a third ear that listens to, so there's two kinds of information here. You have latent, which is the literal, which is like the actual language, the words that you are saying. And then you have the manifest, which is the underlying, so the way that the student speaks, the body language that they have. As an effective teacher who is guiding curriculum in a classroom, you have to be able to watch for both the literal things that are happening and those underlying things. And the way that a lot of people do that is through the use of this idea of the third ear. So you're not only listening to their words, you're also listening for the context. You're building this mind map of who this student is and all of their different extenuating circumstances and how that connects with other people in the room. It's a lot more work than just listening to the words of somebody. It's not just supervising. You're not just sitting there with a hat and a clipboard and a high-vis vest watching what's happening. You have to actually be in there. You have to be invested in building an idea of who this person is in order to reach them effectively as a teacher through this idea of supervision. So the practical effect has less to do with the conceptual content of the teacher's response to the student's statement, but in what the interpretation does to the student, which is what we just said. So can you access the manifest content that the student is unaware of within themselves? Because, this is a little juicy morsel in there, right? And again, this isn't just related to education and teachers. This is also just being a human being and existing in the world as a whole. In that, are you able to recognize your manifest text? like not even related to education, like you as a human being, me, myself, and I can hear the words that I'm saying. I can identify the feelings that I'm feeling, but can I really identify, conceptualize, and assign meaning to the things within my psyche that are motivating me to feel those things, to say those things? Because I think a lot of people don't have the ability, because everything goes in that 3 steps of like, you have a thought, you have a feeling, and an action, right? You don't have control over your thoughts. You have sometimes control over your feelings, and you have complete control over your actions, right? And not everybody has the ability to actually, like, it's hard because some people have a thought and they're able to kind of like trace it back a little bit and think, why am I thinking that? I don't have control over it, but I can identify where it's coming from. And that is a really hard thing to do. And that is something that most kids, in fact, I would say almost all kids, don't have the access to unless they're explicitly taught or unless they go through some early childhood trauma and have to do that out of a sense of safety. That's heavy, but it happens. And it happened to me, and that's probably a big part of why I'm sitting here talking about this stuff and outlining its importance for students, because sometimes we think these emotionally intelligent kids are that way just because they are, and it's not. They were forced to grow up early because of trauma, because of bullying, because of these adverse childhood experiences, that they had to rise to that challenge in order to maintain their safety. And that's a really sad place to be in. And if you can't recognize that in students, you're not going to be able to reach them as effectively and deliver that content to them in such a meaningful way. So then a really beautiful place to take this is, can you take that amount of self-expression? Can you take the peeling back of the layers of the onion like an ogre? Can you take those initial feelings once you pull everything back and turn that into self-expression and turn that into a way to fuel your creativity in order to make meaningful connections and do learning in the classroom? Absolutely, I think you can. And that comes back as we discuss the teacher as an artist as well. Next up, we're going to discuss here is the teacher as a victim. So there's kind of 2 different ways I want to approach this part. We all know the teachers as victims, where they try and play on the empathy of their students. I'm working so hard for you and you're just all talking over me and you're also disrespectful and you're ruining my things and you're all the worst and I'm the best and you're all taking advantage of me, and it's very manipulative, it's very garbage, it's very connection breaking. You're not able to meaningfully teach if you're somebody who's coming to it from that way. It's not always malicious, it's not always done with malicious intent, but at some point you still need to be held accountable for your actions. Your feelings are always valid, but your actions are not. So we all know and have seen these teachers as victims. And that's not to say that one teacher in exclusivity plays this teacher as a victim role. Like, I've definitely had moments where I have played this teacher as victim to students, because sometimes it does come out and sometimes you don't catch it before it does. And you have those moments, and if you're reflecting, if you're paying attention, you can pull it back and go, ooh, I didn't like how that felt. And you're able to fix it and you're able to move on and not do that again if that's not something you're interested in. So that's the kind of like baseline, the teacher is victim. But I saw this and it just really blew my mind. So I'm going to read this to you here. If a monkey hoarded more bananas than it could eat while most of the other monkeys starved, scientists would study that monkey to figure out what was wrong. When humans do it, we put them on the cover of Forbes. I'm just going to let you sit with that one for a moment. And what I want to talk about here, and this has a close connection to the teacher as an activist, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. But at some point, most of us are victims of the system of which we are in. And I think these students are probably one of the largest demographics of victims of this system, because we're adults, we have a little bit more autonomy than the students do, but we are victims of this system. So it is important to mention here that everybody does have a different sense of privilege, and privilege does not mean that you have the absence of struggle. Just because you have privilege in one area doesn't mean you can't struggle in another. So it's not this idea of you have privilege or you don't. It is this idea of a spectrum of how much privilege you have in different areas. It is not a false binary of you have it or you don't. It's different areas. And a lot of these things, a lot of the ways that we have privilege, we're not even aware of, because why would we? It wouldn't make sense to be aware of our privilege, because it's not something that we need to learn and be cognizant of in order to maintain a level of safety. So unless you're doing that work and talking with people and identifying the privileges that you have, it's really hard to do. It is the blissful ignorance of the systematic oppression that does not apply to you. So at some point, like, it is hard to get, sometimes it's hard to get out of this idea of we're all victims of a system. And I have been in this kind of framework and idea, and it's really informed the way that I have brought curriculum, and the way that I've structured curriculum in my classroom is that it's kind of this idea of hopelessness, right? This victim mentality of literally, what's the point of what we're doing here? Because you're not learning math. I'm trying so desperately to try and teach you about pre-algebra, and none of y'all are getting it except 2 of you. And I just feel like we're wasting so much time, and it's this idea of hopelessness. But it's looking a little bit farther beyond the lines of, are we actually teaching pre-algebra here? Or is this one just learning how to use a calculator? Or is this one just learning how to pull out the right book and flip to the right page? Like, there is learning to be had everywhere. There is community to be built. There is curriculum to be developed at every point, even if students are not aligning themselves to these standards that are set about by the government, or even yourself, because of the government. So it is really easy to fall into this teacher as victim mentality. And we see a lot of people in it in different ways throughout different lengths of time and different severities. And yeah, it's just, this is an interesting one. This is an interesting one. I've definitely been on all sides of this equation, so I wanted to mention it here. So the next one here is teacher as producer. So I find that the people that argue against the teacher as performer can really get on board with the teacher as producer from my experience. So I'm interested in the concept of the classroom being built like a theater, right? So if you have your student, it's called the proscenium setup, right? So it's like the movie theater. You have a stage and all of the seats are facing that stage, right? It's the fourth wall. That's that kind of idea here. So it brings forth the idea that students are an audience in the classroom and they're not part of the performance, which, again, that blows. Those kids should be the performers. Those kids should be just as much of the conversation. They need to be active participants, not passive listeners and watchers. Because if you're doing it passively, you might as well go home and watch a YouTube video. There's no point. They need to be performers and active participants in what is happening here. But if the students are performers and the teacher is a performer, should there be a delineation there between the role of the teacher and the role of the student? And in this idea of the teacher as producer, that is that delineation. So in my undergraduate work, I focused on the role of the teacher as performer and further to the facilitator. But now I'm starting to conceptualize the role of the teacher as the producer, if we're to use this idea of a classroom as a theatrical production. Now, the role of a producer in Hollywood, baby, is this idea of the person who has a working understanding of all of the different moving pieces, right? So a producer is somebody who knows all of the actors. A producer is somebody who knows all of the tech people, who knows all of the gaffers, who knows all of the PAs, who know, like, the producer is the one that basically is responsible for kind of running everybody together, right? You have all of these different categories. You have your administrative team, you have your parents, you have your student councils, you have your parent councils, you have the government. And the role of the producer is kind of to take all of those different pieces of information and weave them together into one singular experience for all the students. And that's what I really appreciate about this idea of the producer. And like a lot of these other roles, you have to be able to be listening and present in order to fulfill your duty as the producer. So my story time here is this anti-gravity pen story. So I had a student that he really struggled with sitting in his desk and doing his work, like I do too. Geez, most of us. Anyway, so he would be upside down, he would be standing on the counter, he'd be everywhere and everywhere. And as long as he wasn't being disruptive and as long as he was being respectful, I did not care where he was. He was the only one who could go behind the line of my desk as well. If he wanted to lay under my desk, if he wanted to sit in my nice fancy rolly chair, you go ahead, girl, and do it. It's all up to you. Because he needed it. And that's not to say that students shouldn't be given things that they don't necessarily need, but that was his standard that we had set for him in order for him to be successful. It wasn't necessarily a sense of equality, it was a sense of equity. Because not everybody needs the same thing. Everybody needs different levels of support in all different areas, and everybody needs different levels of support in order to maintain this kind of singular line of achievement. But then again, that's a very social efficiency view of like, does everybody actually need to be able to get themselves to this point of perceived success that is societally constructed by the deficit model of late stage capitalism? So the student was upside down under their desk with their paper on the bottom of their desk, right? And they're writing with a pen. And I can hear them grumbling because the patchiness of the ink, because it's a ballpoint pen, right? And we need gravity in order for that ink to be pushed down into the ballpoint and be transferred onto the paper. And because I'm a little bit of a nerd and I have a fundamental interest in the way that things work, she's got a B-Tech, I started to talk to this kid about the pen that was designed. This might be a callback for some of you, and I'm not aging myself, I'm only 27, but the Seinfeld episode where the anti-gravity pen with the parents in the Boa Vista, anyway, not important. There has been the design of an anti-gravity pen, so you can use it writing upside down. And I started talking with this kid in a very quiet way. I rolled myself over and I was like, I had a picture on my phone and I'm like, did you know that this existed? And then we're talking about science, we're talking about gravity, we're talking about space station. And all of a sudden he's really interested in astronauts and his face is lighting up in a way that I had never quite seen before. And now other kids are getting closer and they're interested too. What do you mean the space station? What does that mean? You mean you can go outside of the world? And now it's this huge conversation of y'all didn't know space travel was Anyway, if you are the teacher as producer, you are, again, it relates to this third ear and this idea of the pedagogical watchfulness. But if you are paying attention and taking those learning opportunities at every point they're available, or every point they're feasible, perhaps, you can create quite a meaningful experience for these students. Because then tell me why we were in the middle of a math lesson and now it's science all of a sudden and the whole class is together and we're talking about space. We're watching the CBC Kids news on the International Space Station and how they're squeezing out the water drops and washing their hair, and these kids are fascinated. It's just, you have the ability as the teacher to produce the learning environment that these students are in. And I don't think teachers always utilize the opportunity that they have to be the producer of their students' day, right? Because let's be honest, it's exhausting. It is exhausting because now I have this math plan that I showed my principal because I'm working on my math lessons, and he comes in and now we're watching the space station video and we're writing upside down with pens. Does that line up to the curriculum? No, it doesn't. And we're going to talk again, that's coming later, about the standards that sometimes you have to break, but it does take an amount of confidence in order to produce a world for these students that is more than mundane and that is more meaningful. Next up, we're going to talk about the facilitator. Okay, this, again, there's a lot of similarities. So many of these are interconnected, like we talked about in the beginning here with holism, because the way that you do one thing is the way that you do everything. But this is just one story I just have to tell you. So at the end of my second year of teaching, it was probably the beginning of June, and I got an email from the learning support teacher of my school, and we had our class lists for the next year. And I remember reading that I had a very high needs student who was on the autism spectrum. His expressive language was very low, but his receptive language was very high. So you could 100% communicate with this student. But I remember, because I was a new teacher, it was the end of my second year going into my third, I was terrified. I was right terrified to work with this student because I didn't have experience with kids with autism, to be completely honest. And the unpredictability of his actions really made me nervous as well, because I had seen things where this student was a runner, he was a hitter, he was a kicker, he was a biter. There were things, and even that is so sad to think about, that I had labeled this student as a biter because he had bit somebody. And I think it's easy to fall into those roles, and I see teachers do that a lot of times, myself included. I'm not some kind of omnipotent person who has all the information. I have a lot of information, but I'm not always able to act on it as well. So I don't want you to listen to this thinking that, oh, David's got it all figured out. No, I don't. But I am constantly looking at my behavior and the behavior of others in order to improve upon the system. It's not about condemning behavior of other people. It's about identifying it. It's about communicating it to improve upon the system. Anyway, so this boats and buoyancy story is all about this student that I had in my classroom, who turned out to be, shouldn't say it because teachers don't have favorites, but yes they do. This boy turned out to be my favorite student I've ever taught, ever, period, hands down, for the ever event till the end of time. I loved this student as if he was my own son. Sorry, I said it. I did. I love him so much. I miss him almost all the time. We created such a meaningful relationship. And that's what it's all about, right? Like if we're talking about curriculum, if this whole presentation is talking about curriculum and education, this student didn't need to sit down at the beginning of the year and learn pre-algebra in grade 4. That just wasn't the reality of his curriculum. His curriculum was completely different. And it's through these roles of somebody who is developing their use of the third ear, who is the facilitator, who is the producer, who is the friend, who is the parent. You're able to reach these students and create a diversified curriculum that meets their needs. Because it's not the needs of the curriculum, it's not the needs of the government, it's not the needs of the school or the teacher, it's the needs of the student. And I think sometimes we get caught up in curriculum of like, who is this made for? Actually, it's not for me, it's not for the government, it's not for the principal, it's for that student. And in conjunction, the communities that they will be a part of and that they are a part of currently. Anyway, so boats and buoyancy. So because this boy did have different needs, he did have an educational assistant that was with him all the time. But in the times that they needed to use the washroom or take a break or this and that, I would be with this student. And it wasn't necessarily part of my assignable time, but I just loved being with this kid. I just did. So I was fine with using my free time just to like hang out with this kid and go walk around the school and talk to people and build relationships. And we would just be always doing the most random stuff at all points of the day. I loved it. It was great. And he came early back in from recess one day, and he loved to lay underneath the palm trees on the carpeted benches in the back of my classroom where the sun would be shining in. And he would just lay there and close his eyes and just like have the best time. And honestly, I would go and do that too because it was so relaxing. And like all those kids are out there screaming at recess and we're just in here with nice calming music playing, some lo-fi tunes, and we're just chilling out here. It was great. Loved it. Great reset. And this happened many times. It was on a bit of a schedule, just a few minutes before the bell would ring and the kids would come back in. And I remember there was one day where this boy was particularly dysregulated and he dumped out the recycling bin. You know, the plastic, the cardboard, the who's its and what's its, and he did. It was quite a mess. And then he's like kicking things around, and I remember going like, "Buddy, what's up? What are you doing? Stop it!" And he needed to have his moment, and that's okay. And I wasn't going to physically intervene. I tried verbally, but he needed to have his time doing that. And you know what? That's perfectly valid for him in that moment. So if he needs to do that, he wasn't a risk to my safety or his own or anybody else's. So you go for it, bestie. Whatever. And then the bell rang, and because he heard the presence of other students, it kind of snapped him out of it, I think. And he went back and sat in his desk, and then it was just me standing in the mess of all of this recycling. And my kids come back in and they're like, MXC, what's going on here? And it wasn't my time or my place to go like, oh yeah, this boy had a moment and dumped it all out, and we need to fix it now, or I need to reprimand him, or whatever the possibilities could have done for any other given situation. But I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I have been struggling to think of a way of how I'm going to start my boats and buoyancy unit in science. But you know what? All of these different raw materials are laying on the ground. You know what we're doing? We're building boats. Start getting things. Start gluing things together. Get the tape, get the glue, get the stapler, get the scissors. I got string. Use these, cut them out. We'll fill this with water and see if we can get them to float, and get your little Lego guys out and we'll just do all this stuff. And that to me is the role of the facilitator. You have to be able to take the extenuating circumstances that are happening in your classroom and turn them into meaningful learning experiences. And this was one of my most proudest moments as a teacher too, because I could have made that pretty embarrassing for that student. And I could have made it awkward, and I could have made a really disjointed way to start that science lesson. But in fact, he gave me the most beautiful opportunity to start this way in some weird way, because who dumps out the recycling and says, make a boat? That's not typically how a structured lesson would start for most students in a classroom. But because it was weird, those kids were interested. And because it was different, those experiences and the actual pieces of like curriculum, those outcomes that I was able to reach in that science lesson were done in such a unique way. And because it was different and unique, it was encoded more meaningfully for those students, or at least I believe that to be the case. So the teacher as facilitator is watching for all of those little things that you can make a connection to. It's kind of like comedy too, right? Connecting things. It does take such a high level of intelligence and skill in order to do these things. It's really fascinating. So next up is the teacher as the artist. So we're going to look at the words of Maria Montessori Montessori. So she argues that educators need to pass beyond the purely speculative stage and basic conclusions to the positive results of experimentation. This idea of experimentation can often be stressful for teachers because while the work we do seemingly does not imply high stakes such as life or death, the implication of teaching practices can extend throughout students' entire lifetimes and can impact communities in long-standing, meaningful, or limiting ways. And then the citation is there as well. A huge part of this is experimentation, is creativity, is artistic endeavor. It really fits into all of these things that we've been talking about. These little delineations of the teacher is this and the teacher of that. I fully believe that you really need to have a hand in all of these different things in order to be a well-rounded educator, in order to bring a meaningful curriculum to your students, because a huge part of this is experimentation. The boats lesson that I just talked about worked beautifully, but the times that I had planned things and it was a flop, that happens. It really does. It happens to all of us. And it's not exclusive to teaching. You have to be able to be willing to be bad at something new. And you need to be able to be transparent with your students and go, well, I thought it was going to go like this. One of my favorite things is to say, oh, that one worked better in my mind. But it's true. Sometimes it does. And if you're trying to fumble your way past a flop and you're feeling self-conscious and it's like shifty and awkward, then the kids kind of soak up that like shifty and awkwardness too, right? But if you're verbal with it and go, well, I thought it was going to go like this, but it didn't. So what do y'all think we should do instead? Because this is what I want to do today, but this isn't going to get us there. So what are your ideas? And 99.9 times out of 100, those kids are going to find ways to get to where you need to go. And it's going to be a much more meaningful and beautiful way to do so than if you created something from your adult brain versus their kid brain, who is more in tune with their peers than you probably are, right? It's all creativity. It's not life. I've said this before in a different reading, and it might be worth noting here as well. It does not imply, while the work that we do seemingly does not imply high stakes, such as life or death, I argue against. Teaching is incredibly high stakes because your entire lifetime can be impacted, and the communities that these students are a part of can be impacted in long-standing, meaningful, or limiting ways, because that's just how the world works. One person can have a huge positive or negative influence on any one person or community. It just happens like that. It's not life or death, it is life and death. Because if you think of a hospital, right? Those nurses and those doctors, it is a matter of life or death, but it is or you live or you die. But in a school system, if, God forbid, somebody does lose their life in a school system, in a school community, those teachers and students that survived them come back to school. If somebody passes away in a hospital, you're probably not going back to that hospital the next day, the next week. It's a matter of life and death. The role of the teacher encompasses all of those different pieces, because you are supporting kids through every single kind of life event imaginable. It might not happen to every single teacher, but every single life experience does filter through the education in some way. It's not life or death, it's life and death. You are celebrating or mourning every single facet of the human condition in an educative context as a teacher. And you need to be able to be creative enough to meet all of those needs in such a way that at bare minimum is not doing more harm to your students than good. You may not have the tools in your box in order to improve upon those situations, but you need to have the tools in your box in order to not make those situations worse. And unfortunately, a big part of building those tools is by making those mistakes. And that really blows, because it does illuminate a missing piece in teacher preparation programs, that they're not able to deal with these things. But again, you can't really pigeonhole these life skills from the educative context to the life context. People get uncomfortable with death. People get uncomfortable with so many things. So we can't really expect that to be any different when somebody is gifted this leadership role of being in charge of a group of students. It doesn't work like that. So we need to have the development of everybody in our world to such a standard that they're able to do this for their students. But at some point, how are we going to instill this sense of creativity and humanness into a generation of people who were not taught that way? I wasn't taught these things. I learned these things, and that is incredibly hard to do. Oh, did I just say I wasn't taught them? I learned them? That's an interesting sentence. But I wasn't taught these things in school. I learned these things on my own time and by mentors that I sought out and paid attention to because I knew there was something about them that I liked, but I couldn't figure out what. But not everybody has that intuition. So the work of the teacher as an artist, it's not always this like hippy dippy idea of like, today we're going to do an impressionist painting of the meaning of the number 4, or like we're going to do an interpretive dance on the meaning of the environment or air pollution. It just doesn't work like that usually. It's not this grandeur idea of artistic expression. It is being creative with what you have in front of you. Next up, we're going to talk about the teacher as the novice. So somebody who's beginning, like, a lot of these things that we're talking about don't necessarily go against, but they are in addition to the set standards that are prescribed for us by the ATA, by governmental bodies, by the government, by the Department of Education. A lot of these rules and standards, it takes time to develop the confidence that you need as a teacher in order to defend yourself by doing things a little bit differently. Right? You're not necessarily breaking rules like I've written here, but you are engaging in things that would be seen as extraneous by a lot of people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you do have to have a level of confidence in order to support yourself if you are ever called to do so. And the novice teachers, the new teachers, they don't have that, which is unfortunate because sometimes they never break out of those set standards. And we've seen those teachers that are rigid rule followers, and they think there's a curriculum police that are going to show up, that if your kids don't know what bed mass means by the end of chapter 4, lesson 3.2, you're going to jail or you're going to lose your whatever. It's not the reality, but unfortunately, again, it leads to this idea that teacher preparation programs are kind of dropping the ball in a lot of these things. Those standards are there, they're there for reasons, and a lot of them are important, but they are a starting point, not the ending point. Curriculum is not some static document that you can print out in the form of a program of studies. Curriculum is everything. It's so much more. There's another piece of research here that I find really interesting, and it brings about a different kind of way to view the teacher as a novice. So what I mean by this is that we are all so much more in this novice role than we think. It's just, we don't know what we don't know. You know what I mean? Sometimes I think about the interrelatedness between the structure of the human eye and the structure of the Milky Way, right? Have you seen that side-by-side comparison of how the iris and pupil of an eye looks very similar to that of the Milky Way? It's quite an image I'm giving you right now. But we don't know what we don't know. And there's so much more metaphysical information that our brains are processing that we just aren't aware of. So it's hard to not come to these hard conclusions about teaching, education, and curriculum and just human nature as a whole, when in fact we are all coming from this place of being a novice. We may not be fresh out of university novices anymore, but there is such a world and body of information that we're not privy to yet. Hopefully one day we will. Probably not in my lifetime. I would love to be a part of that, but probably not. And a way that I would like to kind of share this information is by the Minnesota twin study, because sometimes we can look at this through the frame of nature versus nurture. Is it the way that you are born, or is it the communities that you are a part of? And the answer is, who knows? So there was this study done on 2 twin boys that were separated just a few weeks after birth. And the study is here, and it's clickable for you to go in and, but we're not going to get that deep into it. It just really illuminates that we are such novices and we have no idea what's going on the grander scheme. We have hints, but we don't have it all. So there were these 2 twin boys that were separated shortly after birth, and they were raised by 2 completely different families, not too far from each other. And at some point they did find each other, and then they were studied by the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research. It's a really big research center, and they study more than just the Jim twins. These 2 boys were both named Jim, and they had such an incredible amount of similarities that is consistent beyond a reasonable doubt. So they both had dogs that they named Toy, like a toy, Toy. They were both married twice, and they both married women with the same names. And there was a list of like 10 different things that completely lined up between these 2 experiences of these 2 individuals that did share 100% the same DNA, but grew up completely exclusive from each other, but somehow both ended up working in healthcare, or both ended up marrying a woman named Brenda and then marrying a woman named Mary. I don't believe those are the names, but both wives that they had the same names. Both of their dogs were named Toy. I've never heard of a dog named Toy in my entire life. And you're telling me that these two that's happenstance? No, I don't believe that. So it's interesting, this nature versus nurture conversation, because I think there's a lot more nature at play than we necessarily have an understanding of. So at some point, we are all novices. We don't know what's going on, but we can lead with integrity and we can lead with the attitude of learning. Yeah, that's the end of my sentence. It's just, we can't take this so seriously. Like, we need to take it seriously, but it's not, I don't know. I don't know what the secret sauce is here. We need to take it seriously, but we don't need to take ourselves so seriously. Is that what it is? Curriculum, the idea of educating individuals, is an incredibly serious endeavor, but us on an individual level, what we are doing from moment to moment, I don't think it's that serious. I think we can just be fun little guys who are just like, following our interests. And that can sound incredibly reductionist. And we've had these conversations before of how sometimes it can be reduced into sounding really simple and stupid, to be honest, but there is a lot more beyond that, because that nature piece is a lot more influential than we think it is. Next up is the teacher as the hero. There's two different kinds of heroes that I want to discuss here. So the first one is, it is my experience that many people do not want to search out the truth of life because of the discomfort that they are faced with upon discovery. Specifically in Alberta and throughout Canada, we have an incredibly dark and horrific past that informs the facets of our daily life. The construction and enforcement of the gender binary, the infantilization of women and girls, that pejorative glitter speak, missing and murdered Indigenous women living on stolen land, the discrimination of anyone who exists outside of the Eurocentric cisgendered white male experience. In pursuit of these mysteries of our past, it can be incredibly dysphoric to annihilate the thought of self when dealing with the structures of the present. It can quickly become overwhelming to become aware of the oppressive structures that we exist within today, especially within education. And the idea that scientists need to develop their skills far beyond mechanics and more upon spirit is a challenging idea to integrate when we are living in a society that values things and words and not thought. Again, it's this nature versus nurture. It's really all part of the same conversation. But to some extent, you do need to be a hero to start unpacking a lot of this nonsense for yourself. It needs to start at home first before you can bring it to anybody else. So this is what I wanted to say about the hero here. And there is a big crossover between the hero and the activist. And burnout can be really possible here as well, because you cannot be everything to everyone. You can't be the hero for everybody, but you can be the hero for yourself and maybe a handful of students. And it kind of builds like a pyramid scheme, because if you're able to deliver that to one person, they might be able to deliver that to one person. And if we're all able to do that for 10 people within the course of our lifetime, we've hit up the whole world within 14 rotations, right? So next up, we're going to talk about the teacher as the jester. So sense of humor is a really big piece, and we've talked about how I am a very funny individual, and I use that in my teacher as performer kind of outlook as my role as an educator. So I did find this study that shows that people who are entertaining are good to be around. So this study that I looked up here is that if you have a good sense of humor, you're able to move things from a negative state of mind to a positive state of mind for those people who you are around, who in this case would be your students. And a lot of people who have a high level of emotional intelligence also have a high level of humor, and these two things can build on each other quite nicely as well. So if you are fostering humor in your students, you are most often fostering emotional intelligence, because not everything is funny to everyone all the time, and not everything is funny to the same person in different contexts. So you have to be able to be quite an emotionally literate person in order to provide humor and comedy to anybody. So this idea of the jester, the clown, the jokester, the comedian, I think is really important when you're talking about the teacher's role in the 21st century classroom. It's connected to the performer, of course, again, because it's very similar, but you can have performers who are not comedians, so it is a little bit separate. The teacher as the activist. The first thing here, the study that I read was really, really fascinating in that the rates of child abuse, the study that I read was out of the United States, but it is most likely mirrored in Canada as well, but I don't have the proof for that. But in the United States, the rates of child abuse and the hospitalizations and things that were the indicators of childhood rates of abuse went down significantly during the pandemic. Now, a lot of people argued, and when I first saw this, I thought, well, that's probably because of the lack of mandated reporters, because everybody was home, so there wouldn't be these professionals who were mandated to report instances that they believe were child abuse. But when they started to look at hospital visits and a lot of other key metrics that indicated for child abuse, it kind of disproved that, because there were straight up less instances of child abuse in this time of the pandemic. So there was quite a significant dip in those instances for the pandemic year, and it went back up. So what that alluded to, and what the study is suggesting here, is that the supports that were in place during that time, the financial supports that were in place for families, for healthcare, for food, for not being evicted, for rental assistance, for healthcare. There were all of these supports that were given to these families, and that led to lower rates of child abuse, because these people, these parents, these families were less stressed, and that can lead to lower rates of child abuse. So this idea of activism doesn't only exist within your classroom, it exists on a societal level, because we are existing within a structure of late stage capitalism where so many people are being done a disservice by our government by not having this funding on a regular basis. And a lot of these child abuse instances are because of these extenuating circumstances beyond mental health problems. It is unreasonable to believe that people want to be bad to their kids. I fully believe that most people want good for those children. I fully believe that most people think they are doing the best that they have with their ability. And it's not right and it's not ethical to isolate and blame these individuals when they are a product of the system of which we live. And this study shows that. And a big part of this as well is being a climate defender, this idea of eco-pedagogy. A huge part of activism and social justice leaves out this idea of environmental activism and ecological entitlement that our system of late stage capitalism really plays into. It's frustrating because these instances of child abuse and things like that, they don't exist in a vacuum. It's not some isolated experience. You have to start peeling back the layers and thinking, why? Why is this happening? There are reasons. And the government knows this. This study was published by the government of the United States, and there are similar ones that would mirror this in Canada as well. The rates were similar. They just didn't have a study like this, so I could share this with you and prove it to you in a citation. But one really interesting thing here that caught my attention as well is that they did a study with rats, and they didn't go out into the wild to find an abusive rat. What a sentence that was. They created these abusive rats, and what they did is they took away the bedding of the mom rats, and they weren't letting this mom sleep, and eventually this mom rat would become abusive to her pups. So it is similar to this in that if you're struggling financially, if you are not sleeping, if you don't have food, if you don't have electricity, if you don't have all of these things that we believe everybody should have as a human right, these instances start to rise. And it's not ethical to blame these people and to paint them as the aggressors because that's who they are as people. They are also victims of a structure that everybody else is a part of. So a lot of these pieces really fit into this teacher as an activist, being a climate defender, being a gender abolitionist, as I like to call myself, but like the social construction of masculinity and the fact that so many of us are conditioned to be afraid of femininity. It's not women who are unsafe, it is femininity who is unsafe in a lot of these structures. Eco-pedagogy and social justice, like I mentioned before, and there is a connection to the victim and the hero, as I said as well. The teacher is the scientist. Okay, here's another study that I looked at. It was called the Dutch Hunger Winter. So this study was done on a group of people that existed within the Dutch Hunger Winter. So it was a period of a handful of months where there was a famine going on. And what they found is that in the people that were pregnant in the time of this famine, very short amount of time, it was a span of about 3 months, the women, well, I don't want to say only women because that's not inclusive. So the people that were pregnant during this time had children who had higher rates of metabolic syndrome, which can make sense because they experienced that in utero, even though those children that were born did not experience famine outside of utero. They only experienced it in utero. They didn't experience it as a human being out in the world. They only experienced that kind of secondary sense of famine. But we know, of course, that the DNA from parent to child, I don't want to say maternal because that's not inclusive either. But fascinatingly enough, the children of those children also experienced higher rates of metabolic syndrome, specifically because of that Dutch hunger winter, because of their maternal grandmother going through that small period of a famine. So it really relates to this idea of epigenetics and how things can be turned off and on depending on the way that we live our lives. Again, it's this nature versus nurture. And I bring this study to us to really show that there is so much science that goes on behind the ways that people learn. Genetics and epigenetics is a huge unexplored field, specifically the epigenetics one. And we do, as teachers and as writers and implementers of curriculum, need to be leaning on science because a lot of it is still unknown. And we have to be willing to look at it, and we have to be able to be willing to look at something as if it was something else. Here's to the possibility of things being not as they seem. Second last one here is the teacher as the caregiver. This one, I'm kind of just throwing a bunch of studies at you now, but these just really blew my mind. So this study here talks about how the development of baby teeth and then the development of adult teeth up to about the age of 14 to 16 do develop stress lines similar to that of the lines of rings on a tree. So what that means and what it talks about in this study is that scientists can pinpoint to the day under a microscope by looking at the teeth of an individual when they have gone through physical or psychological stressors in their life. And that can lead to many things as like stress fractures, cavities, all kinds of tooth problems, right? So it's really illuminating to the fact that dental care does need to be trauma informed. And what a wild thing to say, but it's not just a matter of you need to brush your teeth more, you need to floss more. It's not the standard idea of gaslighting people into making them think that it's their own fault, that they're experiencing these adverse realities. It's this idea of capitalism getting people to blame themselves in order to not illuminate the fact that people are participating in an unequitable structure that is responsible for a lot of their detriment. It's not personal responsibility for the most part. And I think that's a really harmful thing. So this idea of trauma-informed dental care, like there are so many ways that we don't know that stress and adverse experiences affect our body. So really fostering this idea of the role of a caregiver can be really meaningful and important for our students, not blaming them for anything. It's just so important. And lastly here, can you care for others more deeply than you're able to care for yourself? We've talked about this before. If you can't give it, people are only able to meet you as deeply as they've met themselves. I think about that all the time. It's super important. So at some point, we're going to have to educate the teaching force to be able to do these things that they were not taught themselves. And that's going to be a challenge. Finally, we're going to look at this idea of the teacher as human. So are you the personification of the things you are asking of your students? Because water seeks its own level. You can't expect them to do things for themselves that you are not doing for yourself. This idea of hypocrisy can create a relationship that's not super meaningful for these students, which means they're not going to learn in such a meaningful way. Can teaching happen where the lives of teachers and students are ignored? Again, people don't exist in a vacuum. You have to be able to look at each individual. Teachers are not to contaminate the results through their own intervention. We've talked about that before. And this big think video, does your experience match reality? Now, I'm going to play this here just because I think it's a really mind-bending video. I'm not going to comment on it because this is far too long already, but this is just one that really blew my mind here. The link is there as well. I'm going to play this here right now, and then we're going to come back and we're going to watch one last thing before we finish up here. So I'll be right back.
Philosophers have been arguing about this for like as long as philosophy has existed. The question of, does your experience match reality, or are you really experiencing reality in its stark objective truth? And the answer is simply not exactly. Reality for us is what we can sense with our sensory surfaces and what we can make sense of with the signals in our brain. The signals in our brain are as necessary for our experience of reality as the sensory signals that come from the world. So I'm going to use a metaphor to describe how the brain works. It goes something like this. Your brain, my brain, everybody's brain, is trapped in its own dark, silent box called your skull. And the brain has no knowledge of what is going on around it in the world or in the body, right? Because it's in this skull and it's receiving sensory signals from the sensory surfaces of your body. These signals are the outcomes of some changes in the world or in the body. But the brain doesn't know what the changes are. It's receiving the outcomes. And that is what philosophers and scientists call the reverse inference problem. You start with an outcome and you have to guess at the cause. For example, if you hear a loud bang, it could be a car backfiring, a door slamming, it could be a gunshot. Your brain doesn't know what the causes are, it only knows the effect. And so it has to guess. And the guess is important, right? Because you would do different things if it's a gunshot versus if it's a windy day that slammed a door. And luckily, it has one other source of information, and that is your past experience. The really cool thing about this, if that wasn't cool enough, is that it's actually doing it predictively. Sometimes scientists talk about this as the brain running a model of the world, but the brain is not running a model of the world. The brain is running a model of its body, and it's doing it in this really interesting way. In psychology, a group of instances which are similar is called a category. In essence, what your brain is doing when it's making a prediction, it's creating a category of instances from the past which are similar in some way to the present in order to predict what's going to happen next, what the brain has to do next, and what your experience will be next. And so when a human brain is creating a category, you have to ask, what features of similarity is it using? Is it these sensory and motor features? An apple is round, an apple is hard and crunchy, or is it these abstract features, abstract multimodal summaries of patterns of features? I could take a bunch of apples and I could say, well, these are good for baking and these are not good for baking. And these patterns, this summary, only exists in your brain. Because our brains are structured to construct categories based on the function of things rather than what they look like or taste like or smell like, humans can create something called social reality, which is where we collectively impose a function on objects that the objects don't have by virtue of their physical nature. So a really good example of this is money, little pieces of paper. We all agree that these little pieces of paper have a function of value. And it turns out that many things that we think of as being part of reality are actually like this. We can draw lines in the sand and create the borders of countries, which creates categories of people called immigrants and citizens. We can create governments because we all agree that certain actions, like making little tick marks, has a meaning to elect someone into a position that has certain powers. It's a form of social reality. In our lab, we work on the hypothesis that many psychological categories are forms of social reality. We impose a meaning on a scowling face that it did not evolve to have, but because we all agree that it has that meaning or that function in a particular culture, then it does. To say that your brain resides in a dark, silent box doesn't mean that you are trapped in that box. Your brain has this wonderful capacity to take bits and pieces of past experience and create something completely new that you've never experienced before. We call it imagination. That's a double-edged sword, right? Because our brains are so good at imagining and creating predictions that are not yoked to our immediate surroundings, sometimes we have a lot of trouble staying in the present. You have to practice your ability to control how much you want to be constrained by what's going on outside that box and how much you want to be free of it.
Okay, so now my final thoughts here. We're going to listen to some words by N. Shackleton Jones, who is an educational author out of the UK. We're going to watch this TikTok video, and it's just fascinating to me. And the words of N. Shackleton Jones, I just love saying that. N. Shackleton Jones are just so inspiring to me. And I think it's just a beautiful way to finish off this conversation here.
There are many things that can shorten your life: drink, drugs, obesity, and cigarettes. But the one which will do the most damage by far is routine. I don't mean that routine will damage your body, although it probably does. Imagine that your life was so terribly routine that every single day was pretty much the same. As a result, at the end of your life, you would have only lived just one day. This is because, as the Czech writer Milan Kundera wrote, memory retains no more than 100 millionth, in short, an utterly infinitesimal bit of lived life. It is as if during our lives we only retain a handful of snapshots of what we've lived. the highlights. We live only to the extent of our feelings. We live only so far as our stories. In fact, research shows that people tend to recall more events from their teenage years, tailing off into their late 20s. This is probably because you're encountering more experiences for the first time during that period, but also because your emotional systems are their most intense and unconstrained, since your higher order emotional regulation is still developing. Novelty and emotional intensity work hand in hand to create lasting memories. What I'm saying here is more than a poetic hunch. The psychologist David Eagleman had participants experience a frightening free fall of 31 meters, then measured their estimates of the time it took to fall. Their estimates were out by 36% as compared to observations of others' falls. His conclusion was that this time dilation effect was a consequence of recollection, not perception. Emotionally charged experiences lead to richer encoding, which in turn distorts our memory of them. Live a dull life, your life shrinks. Our lives are measured in adventures, not years.
Our lives are measured in adventures and not years. This beautifully sums this up for me so well, is that if you are not creating a curriculum that is full of adventure, that is full of idiosyncrasy, that is full of fun and random, stupid, silly, seemingly sometimes meaningless, if you're looking at it from a reductionist point of view, things for your students, it's going to be boring. Things need to be exciting. You need to be the performer, the producer, the human, the parent, the friend. You need all of these pieces together working in tandem in order to create a meaningful curriculum experience for your students. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of D-Talk. It has been a long one, so thank you for sticking this out with me here. I hope you learned something. If you liked this video, leave a like. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike. Consider subscribing to the channel. If you're listening to Spotify, leave me a review, ask a question, do all the things. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, goodbye.